It is July 16th, 1945. A dozen girls on a camping trip in Ruidoso, New Mexico wake up to find snow falling outside their tents. They run around catching the flakes, wondering why they feel warm to the touch. It is August 6th, 1945. In the sky above Hiroshima, a light appears that becomes brighter than the sun. It lasts only a second, and when it fades, over 70,000 men, women, and children lay dead or dying, and the world has changed. Even among the horrors of the Second World War, the atomic bomb stood out as an event with unique political, social, and psychological repercussions. Almost as soon as the news of the bombing was broadcast, people began to speculate about the possibility and the consequences of an atomic war. As nuclear technology proliferated, warheads were manufactured in the tens, then hundreds, then thousands with increasingly destructive power, and the threat shifted from widespread devastation to the end of civilization to the possible extinction of the human race. At the same time, the deployment of the weapons also changed, transitioning from slow-moving bombers to ballistic missiles, some of which could be installed on launch vehicles that shortened the time till impact from hours to minutes. People struggled to understand these developments. They tried to understand what would happen to their family and friends, their home, their way of life if there was a nuclear exchange. Governments responded to the growing unease about the nuclear buildup by issuing press releases, pamphlets, films, and programs that deliberately downplayed the grisly aspects of a nuclear exchange, blithely instructing people to duck and cover if they saw a flash. While some scientists openly campaigned for disarmament, most concentrated on the science and wrote articles about yields, alpha, beta, and gamma particles, and gave lectures about the differences between Roentgen, REMS, and RADS. Meanwhile, pundits from international relations, national security, and military sectors debated strategic initiatives, retaliation escalation, and collateral damage in newspaper columns and television specials, all in clinical and abstract terms. One comment often expressed was that nuclear war was simply unthinkable. One group that did contemplate the unthinkable were writers who responded with everything from songs and poems to short stories and novels, which explored what the nature of a nuclear war and its aftermath might look like. The stories ranged from horror to comedy, from fantasy to drama. Some would languish in obscurity with barely a review to their notice, while others went on to become bestsellers and were adapted into movies. Stories about nuclear war were often dismissed out of hand by critics who did not consider them serious literature, dismissing them as trite warnings, maudlin mourning pieces, or mere apocalypse porn. While there was some undeniable dross among the flood of titles, there were many outstanding works. There was Children of the Dust by Louise Lawrence, which imagined how generations would grow up in a post-apocalypse and try to rebuild the world. Tomorrow by Philip Wiley went into detail about the horrific results of a nuclear strike and the systemic problems in America that made disaster all the more likely. On the Beach by Neville Shute looked at the lives of the last survivors of a nuclear war and how they would face their mortality at the end of the world. It was these stories that captured public attention and shaped the perception of nuclear weapons, not government programs, political elites, academics, or the intellectual establishment. This is a series about the literature of the nuclear age, how it reflected the fears and uncertainty of that time, the cultural attitudes, and social values. This series is indebted to the efforts of Paul Bryans, whose book Nuclear Holocausts, Atomic War and Fiction 1895 to 1984 was an invaluable resource in discovering many titles. There is, of course, an issue with any survey of stories from the nuclear age, as the publishing industry during that time offered few places for women and people of color, while queer perspectives were almost non-existent. Despite this crippling gap, there is still value in examining the stories of that period, as they offer an insight into a past difficult to describe. The nuclear age was reflected in everything from music to clothing to architecture. It affected how people talked. It was something that lay in the background of almost every human endeavor. Martin Amis wrote of this saying, quote, "The man with the cocked gun in his mouth may boast that he never thinks about the cocked gun, but he tastes it all the time," unquote. Yet with rare exceptions, most of the novels of the nuclear age have been forgotten, consigned to the bargain bin in used bookstores or the trash. This is understandable as the threat of a full exchange has essentially vanished. Fallout shelters are being repurposed into data centers, nuclear silos into homes for the 1%, and radiation detectors go for pennies in surplus stores. Several generations have now grown up believing that a nuclear war is as distant as rotary telephones and 8-track tapes. However, while the social, cultural, and political structures of the nuclear age are becoming difficult to discern, they still remain. It is August 6th, 2022. Survivors gather in Hiroshima to mark the anniversary of the dropping of the bomb. The survivors are recognized as hibakusa, translated sometimes as those affected by exposure. They are not only victims of the bomb but of continued discrimination. They have difficulty finding employment or partners. Even though the effects of radiation are well understood today, they and their children still have to fight for acceptance. It is June 7th, 2022. The United States House passes a 2-year extension of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. It does not offer anything for the girls of the dance camp who played in the fallout that fell from the New Mexican sky so many decades ago. Almost all of them died of cancer before they reached 40. Only one survives today.